welcome you to the October webinar sponsored by the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School in collaboration with the VOA Center on Moral Injury. I'm Nancy Ramsay, Director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School on the campus of TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. The center provides resources for religious leaders and professional caregivers who support veterans and their families and active duty personnel affected by moral injury. September through May, we offer free monthly webinars with a focus on topics relevant to veterans' lives that have been inadequately covered or not yet addressed. Within 10 days or 2 weeks, links to these webinars are then posted on our website at Brite, where you will also find ample additional materials related to moral injury. This webinar addresses a substantial increase in suicide among personnel not linked to PTSD. According to the New York Times article noted here, young men in the military who have never deployed in combat are at highest risk of suicide. The New York Times article cited a former officer at Fort Riley suggesting suicide has become a normal part of Army culture. Armored units are especially affected. The intense pace of its training, sustainable readiness methodology may also contribute to the stressors. This webinar draws on the wisdom of two deeply informed representatives of Army leadership who draw on their expertise to expand on the fact and implications of the substantial rise in suicide apart from PTSD and even battlefield experience. We also encourage you to review the attached link from the New York Times article. Our presenters are Colonel Mark Lee, Chaplain, U.S. Army, began his service as Dean of the Army Graduate School in September of 2023. Previously, he directed the ACPE Center at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. Mark holds a DMin and PhD and certifications in ACPE and BCC. Chaplain Green previously served as Chief of Theater Spiritual Resilience as the U.S. Army Europe-Africa Headquarters in Wiesbaden, Germany. He also served in South Korea and deployed twice in Iraq. Prior to his service in the Army, Chaplain Lee served as a senior pastor of Community Church of Honolulu and concurrently as chaplain in the Hawaii Air National Guard. He holds a PhD from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, a DMin from Erskine Seminary, and an MDiv from Princeton Theological School, and an MBA and BS from the University of Southern California. Brigadier General retired Stephen Xenakis, MD, is an adult, child, and adolescent psychiatrist. He retired from the U.S. Army in 1998 at the rank of Brigadier General and entered an active career in startup medical technologies and clinical practice. He has advised the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other senior Department of Defense officials on mental health, the effects of blast concussion, and suicide. During his career in the Army, he pioneered the introduction of telemedicine applications, including the development of a device for electronic house calls. He has an active clinical and research interest in promising medical technologies. He founded the Center for Translational Medicine to develop treatments and conducts tests on brain-related conditions affecting both veterans and soldiers. U.S. Navy Captain W. Kyle Fauntleroy will be monitoring the chat. Please feel free to share your questions and observations there. Sam McAllister, the production staff manager for VOA, is ably producing this webinar. Our format will proceed with presentations by Colonel Lee and retired Brigadier General Stephen Xenakis. After the first 45 minutes of our webinar, I will join these presenters for initial conversation arising from their presentations. At the top of the next hour, we will open the webinar for inviting them to respond to the observations and questions that you pose in the chat. The webinar will conclude at 3:30 Eastern. Within 10 days, a full copy of this webinar will be available at the Soul Repair site on the website of Brite Divinity School and on the website of Volunteers of America. I also invite your attention to the June 19th article in the New York Times Magazine, which is cited on Brite's website. Now, let's begin and learn from our colleagues. Mark, why don't you begin?
Okay. Yeah, I'm having some low band issues here from the Army system, so everything's kind of freezing up a little bit. Well, good afternoon. I'm pleased to join with all of you here. I think one of the key points is the issue of suicides and suicide ideations as well as completed suicides. And it is true that the number or the rate of suicides, including ideations, attempts, and completions, have been rising. And I think they continue to do so year over year. And it is an issue that the larger Army is attempting to address. And we're spending a lot of time, energy, and money at getting after the sources and the reasons why. And so as far as my experience is concerned, the chaplaincy, at least in the Army, the Army chaplaincy, as well as those professionals in the medical field, including behavioral health, have been collaborating. And the larger issue, of course, is the problem for the Army at large. And so it is something that is not just relegated down to different sections or staff sections to solve, but it is a problem that the chief of staff of the Army is very much interested at resolving and getting to the root of the issue. And so the Chaplain Corps has been looking at different ways over at least the last 2 decades that I've been in the Army, different ways in which we can address the issues. I think there are some issues that are related to combat, obviously, but we do see a rise in non-combat experienced soldiers. And whether or not that's, there are several different factors I think that we need to look at. It's factors that are pre-existing conditions. So we're also having to take, I think, a serious look at adverse childhood experiences, in other circles called ACEs. And so the childhood traumatic experiences that people come into the military with that make them more vulnerable as a population to other traumatic events. And also as a result of their childhood experiences, a lot of our younger soldiers are coming into the military without a whole lot of coping skills or support. And so I think systemically, we are really looking at what are the ways in which we can help with resiliency issues, with coping mechanisms, as well as addressing and identifying soldiers that come into basic training and at advanced individual training with pre-existing childhood trauma that can be identified. So we're having chaplains take a look at that, and behavioral health are looking at that. And then in many battalions, especially at basic training and AIT, we're collaborating across the disciplines and really identifying the soldiers that have pre-existing issues and then working with them to help mitigate before other eventual traumatic events or stressors of life can overwhelm them. And so, of course, we've had the traditional suicide prevention training, like ironically called ACE in the Army, Ask, Care, and Escort. That seems to have been one of the better training programs that we have been able to get out to the Army. And it goes down to the squad level, at which the younger junior NCOs are able to work with the enlisted squad members, the soldiers that are in their formation, and really get to know them and work with. The training is so easy to remember: Ask, Care, and Escort. But we also realize that that's not been sufficient. So we're continually looking at ways in which we can identify soldiers before negative events happen and work with them. One of the key things is to make sure that there is connection with the chaplain of the unit or the 56 Mike, which is the religious affairs specialist or the NCO of the unit, and identify them and work with them, and then connect them to the necessary resources that are available to them on their installation. So again, we are currently working with MedCom. So the Chaplain Corps is working with MedCom and looking at developing a program that could be used. And we're also working with other researchers that have looked into various suicide prevention programs. So I think a lot of those are forthcoming in terms of hopefully better programs and training programs for both the leaders at the lowest echelons, as well as the UMT, unit ministry teams, as well as behavioral health professionals. And so collaboration is an ongoing effort, and suicide prevention is a huge issue that we want to address. And then, of course, but there are some sort of lanes in which we must stay. So, collaboration is great, dialogue is great, but also recognizing that the chaplains are not behavioral health specialists nor medical professionals. So we need to take that sort of seat in recognizing that a lot of the medical research and the behavioral health research and modalities of treatment come from the medical field. And then we can collaborate in terms of actually reaching out to the soldiers and implementing some of the methodologies and training programs that could help with suicide prevention. I think I'm going to yield the rest of my time to Dr. Xenakis.
Well, appreciate it. Thanks. And thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and glad to be able to now talk to all our Army chaplains and others who are working with our soldiers and families. So I really am pleased to be here and very much I've enjoyed what you had to say, Chaplain Lee, and I kind of want to build on that for our conversations and what we could think about ways that we could do our work and help our Army and continue and build its strength and build the families as help and support our families. So let me start with framing this in a way that builds, again, supplements what you said, which is that first, as Nancy said, I'm a retired Army psychiatrist. I have an active practice. I served in the Army. I came in 1970. I served until 1998. When I came in, we had a draft Army. We transitioned to a volunteer force in 1975. I felt strongly at the time that as a young doctor, I did my training out there at the Presidio San Francisco, that if I was going to be the most effective psychiatrist, one of the areas of study that I needed to develop further was understanding child and adolescent psychiatry. And I say this to really specifically refer to observations and ideas that Chaplain Lee was talking about. What I felt was apparent was that at the time we had a draft, we were drafting young men who were 18 years old. They're teenagers, they're adolescents. Even now, as you look at those, the men and women who come into the military, they're 18, 19, 20 years old. They're adolescents, they're young people. They're still in a very dynamic phase of their development. And of course, now as our science has progressed, we know that the neurological development, the changes in the brain continue very much up till about 25 in males, maybe 23, 24 in females. So this is a time of a lot of change. And we see that in these young people, that they're going through physiologic changes, they're going through mental changes, they're going through lifestyle changes. I mean, they're even spiritually, they're looking around trying to figure out what they have to do. And I think as we think about the kinds of responsibilities that we have as doctors and chaplains, one of the things, what we can be oriented towards is how do we help these people through that developmental phase? And the suicides, and it's a direct reference because the suicides we're seeing, we have two different sort of periods. We have these young people, 20, 21 or so, that are committing suicide. And then we have an older cohort. And I'll talk a little bit about that older cohort, because that cohort of soldiers who are having problems with suicide, also many of them traumatic brain injury, they have been through combat, and that is affecting them in a very different way. But I want to focus in on that young group, because what I think one of the ways that we can be in this profession most effective is to think about how we promote and support their growth and development. My practice has not been particularly with young people to think about pathology. Now, that is a bit different than what many of my colleagues do. And in fact, much of the work that's been done in suicide, and I have been working in this area with the Army since about, for 15 plus years. I was in fact, helped produce the first report by the Army Science Board on suicide in 2008 and briefed it to the Chief of Staff of the Army. We look at this problem of suicide and other as a particular indicator of illness, pathology, or conditions. I mean, Army has spent $55 million on Army Stars to try and figure out how suicide happens. A lot of good science has come out of it, but I really think our effort as practitioners is, let's try and understand and connect as effectively as we can with these young people as they're going through this growth and development. And then as we do that, we can be most effective when it comes to protecting them from these kinds of horrific events if they commit suicide and other problems in their life. And there is a model. I mean, a lot of good work, and I think, again, Chaplain Lee's mentioned that. A lot of good work's been done, and there are programs. I really also think that it's in the spirit of how we do that. And by the way, we do that as a team. We do that as medics, and we do that as chaplains, and we do that as social workers. All of us who are have the mission and have accepted the responsibility to help the most human aspects of the lives of our soldiers and families. We have our lanes, we have what we know, we have our training, but it's really most important is how we connect with these young people. So what is the model that is useful here? I think the model comes back to Erik Erikson. And there was a great book. I had the privilege that he was my teacher when I was in training for child and adolescent psychiatry in San Francisco in the late 70s. He lived out in Tiburon, if any of you have been out there. He taught frequently. I did my fellowship at joint program with the Army had with University of California, San Francisco, and he came in and he really taught us and trained us to be the most effective clinicians and helpers that we could be. Erikson was a sociologist, and he knew pathology as it was thought of at that time. He was grounded in developmental theory, he was grounded in psychoanalysis, but he was an observer. And he was a person who first wrote about that people go through 8 stages of life. And obviously it's just a heuristic, it's just an idea, but it's a very useful idea because we can look at a person at a particular point in time and ask ourselves, what in fact psychologically is going on with them? I mean, what is their capacity to think? How well do they think? Are they, as we know in our children, they do concrete operations. In other words, they if-then kinds of things. Do they have the capacity to abstract? Are they people that are more fact-based? Are they people that are more emotion-based? How important is it for them to connect to people? So you first look at what is the mental sort of structure, capacity of the individual. Then you ask yourself, what are the day-to-day challenges of that person? What are their developmental tasks? What do they have to do in terms of learning or gaining skills? or being able to accomplish what's most important? What are also they being asked to do as developmentally in terms of their work? Then you also ask, what are their social relationships? How good are they? What's the history of those social relationships? You know, as Chaplain Lee said, we have a good study and good information about adverse childhood events, ACEs as we call them. What does that mean? That means that if you are a child, if you've been lucky enough to grow up in a loving family where the parent or the parent that's taking care of you has had reliable, solid employment, you can go to a school that's safe, you live in a neighborhood that's safe, that you've had food on the table, that your community has been friendly, and you feel really safe in being out in that community, and you've not and and you have perhaps a religious group that you belong to, and that religious group is supportive and loving and taking care of you. That's a person that has been very, very fortunate. There are many, many young men and women that don't have that in fact have grown up in environments where they didn't have they couldn't get food on the table. If any of you have ever, I've worked in hospitals where we had any number of children and adolescents. I was a chief of child psychiatry for a hospital in Washington, D.C., and these kids didn't know if they were going to they had to go to school to get breakfast. And they weren't sure of, in fact, if their parent was going to be the one who was sleeping in that home tonight with them. They may be assaulted and abused sexually and physically. There are too many young people that grow up like that and have had these events that have really, damaged and imprinted in their lives. In fact, one of the things that we need to acknowledge, and that the data shows, is that the way we recruit young people is that we say to young men, and in the Army that I was very much helping to develop in the 80s, it was be all you can be. And then I know recently there was a slogan of, Army of One and all this, and now we're going back. What are we saying? We're saying to young people, look, if you feel like you want to have an opportunity and you've lived in a world that has been very difficult and challenging, and you don't think that community you've grown up with is going to give you those opportunities, come join the Army, because we will give you those opportunities. We'll give you a chance to get educated. We'll give you a chance to have skills. We'll give you a chance to build relationships and know how to be someone that you want to be. That's terrific. That's how we get a great Army. But that's been there for as long as probably the Army's been around. My own father joined the Army in 1939, the child of Greek immigrants, exactly to do that, to get out of the Depression in West Virginia and the aftermath so he could go on and have an opportunity. Now, that's not easy. What we have to recognize respectively as medical people and as chaplains, that's very difficult. So that a 20-year-old with the hopes and dreams that he or she has now comes into a military. Yeah, they learn some skills, they learn some discipline, they get routines in their lives that they've never had, but it shakes things up. And when it shakes things up, then in fact, their moods can go up and down. And I have studied dozens and dozens of cases of suicide. And what I've learned in studying these cases of young people is that for whatever reason, they will have a moment or they will have a day that they don't think there's any hope. They came in with big hopes. They came in with ambitions. They came in wanting to do something that they didn't think they'd ever would be able to do, and they've lost that hope. And by the way, because they're young people, part of the brain development is they don't really have the kind of long-term planning that those of us who are more mature have. So really, if there's no hope and it's a dark day, it's over for them. And that's, those who have lived have told me that was their story. Now, what does that mean? That means that these people are looking, they're coming to us for some sense of being able to, for us to understand what they need, to understand what they're looking for us to grasp why they feel so disconnected, for us to grasp why the world looks so dark to them, and to be able to see them through that. And almost, and I would say, it works best when we don't pathologize it. We don't give it a diagnosis. They may have a problem. They may even have something that would require medication that I would prescribe. What I really need them to know is that they can connect. Because rapport, and the rapport with the healers and the helpers, is probably the most powerful agent for being able to get people out of these difficult situations. And that's what we have to, and that's where we work together to do that. Now, we're a team. And I always found at the times when the assignments I had, I spent 4 years at Fort Hood. I started a training program at Eisenhower Army Medical Center, now called Fort Eisenhower, it was called Fort Gordon then. I was a commander at Fort Campbell. I was commanding general of the Southeast. I felt that at all of these installations, what worked best was when there was a working group of the medics, the chaplains, the social workers, and the human resource people. Because the soldiers themselves and the families really don't come in with labels. They don't come in and say, oh, I'm a medical problem, I'm going to the clinic. Oh, I'm a spiritual problem, I'm going to go see the chaplain. Oh, I don't have food on the table. You know, I'm having, sorry about this phone. I'm having trouble, you know, feeding my family, and I need some food stamps or other support or plans with my housing. What they know is they've got some challenges. So they've got, and they want somebody to help them. And the first person they see, they want to be able to unload that whole story. And then that person, as part of a team, says, you know, maybe you do need to go see the medic. I think mental health can help you with this. Or let's see what we can do. Maybe you need better childcare. Maybe we do need to take care of your house. But we're working together, a team, so we're giving this person, the soldier and the family, the support they need, and then we're giving them a pathway to go forward. We're giving them something that says, oh, they are real. I can touch and feel it. I'm going to get the help that I need. So that's the young people. We have to ask ourselves, why is it that in our young people, our young soldiers, we have more suicides than the general population, and have more suicides than we've had historically? Is there something about these young people's lives that, in fact, makes them feel that suicide is an option for them, or something that they have to do that their friends in the communities may or may not feel, and historically? I think that's what we have to figure out case by case, soldier by soldier, family by family. The science helps, it's important, it can guide us, but the most important thing for us to do is develop that rapport with that soldier and let that soldier and family know we're here to support them. So that's the young people. Those are the young people that I've seen in my practice. and have had the privilege of being able to help over the years. There's another group of people that are older. Now they're senior sergeants, or they're field grade officers, or even more senior than that, had multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And many of them not only have the memories of the combat and what happened to them, and that really traumatized them, but also suffered traumatic brain injury. And it really has only, for many, many years, the Army did not really acknowledge the seriousness of these repeated blasts to the brain. And I know, because I had many, many conversations with senior leadership starting in 2004, alerting them to what I thought would be the impact of the IEDs, as well as other head injuries that were going to affect the mental state of our soldiers. What we need to understand is that these soldiers who have had multiple IED blasts and have head injury, day to day feel that there's something wrong, physically wrong with them. And it's a struggle. It's hard. They're tired. They have headaches. In fact, most of these concussions affect their brain, the sleep center in their brains, and they're having trouble sleeping. They're having real difficulty getting what we call restorative sleep. And if you don't get good sleep, it's really hard to be, I mean, you're going to get depressed over time. You're going to struggle because you don't think you can do your job and you can think clearly, and you're going to get more anxious. And after a while, it gets tiring for these young folks. I say young because they're 30s and 40s, and I'm much, much older than that. And they feel like they have no future. They've gone to get treatment, and they've tried this treatment and that treatment, and they've been told this. Many of them prescribed medicines, and medicines probably, most of the treatments don't work in half the people. And if they get a little symptom relief, they don't get the quality of symptom relief that they want or need. The medicines sometimes make them feel worse, and they say, I don't see why I can continue or why I should continue. Now, lots of times, of course, this is where, again, the chaplains and the doctors team up, and as well as the other folks, the social work support. Because if I've talked to a number of veterans who had multiple tours in combat, that were raised in very religious families and backgrounds, who, as they returned to the combat theater, and then they saw what the injuries and so forth, and had lost their fellow soldiers and had the TBIs, they lost faith. In fact, many of them say they became atheists, completely lost faith, and they completely lost hope, which then started them on the road to suicide. This is complicated because they can't sleep. And if they can't sleep, how are they supposed to have anything optimistic, anything to look forward to? They're always tired and they feel bad. They're having problems thinking. How can they grasp what should be their faith? How should they grasp that they can be loved and they can love? How should they grasp that there are good things in this world? It becomes very, very difficult. They need and are searching for something spiritual to anchor their lives and give them hope. At the same time, they're really looking to the medics to get something that's going to help them with their day-to-day problems. This is where we have to team up. And in fact, as happens so many times, sometimes they first come in to see the medic, sometimes they first come into the chaplain. And each of us, in our particular way, go about establishing the rapport and having the relationship that we need to have with these people so that we can bring all this out and help them in a more holistic way. This is a big concept in medicine because we're recognizing that what we do now doesn't quite meet our goal of being patient-centered, of being individualized. Medicine is organized around diagnoses. But a patient is much more than the sum of the diagnoses. That's extremely important. And to be patient-centered, we have to think beyond what might be the diagnoses that were considered and think about everything going on in that person's life. And think about how we need to coordinate with the other people that could affect and touch that person's life. Think about what are their goals and aspirations, not just relieving their symptoms. How do we give them a path? How do we open up the road so that they can do what is important to them and they can have the most gratifying and fulfilling life? So the concepts of being patient-centered are those that we can use. And if we're lucky, if things work right, over time, we'll see that's how medicine now shifts. It shifts to become more patient-centered. And I think for that way, the Army is a perfect environment for being able to do soldier-centric, family-centric, patient-centered interventions and to give support to these young men and women and older men and women and help them as they do what they need to do to be good soldiers and families and also give to the country. And understand that, back to Erickson, so these older soldiers have been through combat, are then going to face a transition phase in their life. I think our responsibility as leaders, I felt it clearly as a commander and then as clearly as a doctor, was to help those soldiers go through their transition as well. They're transitioning as young people. They've come in from where their home is and what their community. They've now tried to learn a new lifestyle and learn some habits they didn't have. It was tough. It shook them up. They get through that. We help them as senior leaders. We guide them. They go through their career, and then we do the same thing as they're transitioning out. That's what we're here to do, and that's what's so rewarding about it. And that's why I think it's always been such a great privilege to be an Army doctor. So thank you so much. And look, I hope we have a real vigorous, energetic discussion.
Thank you very much. I want Mark Lee has asked for a few minutes to rejoin this conversation. So, Sam, let's give Mark the floor again.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. Xenakis. I think all your points are very well understood and taken. And I just want to add that I think for us, at least for me, from my research and as a theologian, this is where a couple of things that I think need to struggle with overall. Is the one thing is, I'm glad you mentioned Erickson. James Fowler took Erickson's stages of development and put stages of faith development in there. And that's very important to recognize where people are in the stages throughout their lives. The other very important part is, as I mentioned before, is especially for chaplains, as we work in collaboration with the medical professionals, one thing that is very important, and this is why I think the Army had it right over all the other services, is that we have chaplains and religious affairs specialists from the battalion level on at each echelon. Every single battalion has a chaplain, right? And that's part of the importance of having relationships, so that the community, so the chaplain and the religious affairs specialists become, for those who are suffering and those who are in need, that one-on-one community and support network that the soldiers need. And then, of course, we continue to build that community by bringing in other professionals who can listen and provide care. And the other part of that is also to understand that the changing religious landscape of America is very reflective in the military. We have people who are more and more spiritual but not religious, or the nuns, as we say, no religious affiliation, not whatsoever. So a lot more people are identifying, I'm spiritual, but I don't have a particular faith background. And the question and the challenge for, I think, a lot of the chaplains is how do we then sort of unchurch the language and speak in a vernacular that is appropriate to those who don't have the church language. And that is something that I think the Army Chaplain Corps has done a good job of and continues to do a great job as we train and educate our chaplains from the basic level to our professional development areas as CPE and family life, is to really listen in for ways in which we can be proactive and be present for those who are struggling. And again, at the end of it all, is, as we talk about in the chaplaincy, is the ministry of presence, right? That we are sitting there very actively listening and being present with those who are suffering, and that they have a sense of network and support. And it's really great that you're encouraging the medical professionals to do the same, because that's exactly what my work with the combat stress control folks years ago with our behavioral health professionals. It's one thing that I kept, especially as psychiatrists who love to prescribe medication. It's like, listen to what's behind what they're saying. Don't just pathologize and listen to the symptoms, but listen to what is actually being said behind the symptoms. So thank you. I just want to add that in. Thank you very much.
And Sam, I wonder if you could bring Mark and Stephen and I together for the final part of the presentation portion of this webinar. And I wonder if, first of all, I want to privilege questions you might have for each other. Mark just raised some. Stephen, I wonder if you have any questions for Mark or response to what he said.
Well, I mean, I would love to learn more how they've been thinking about connecting with young people who are unchurched. I mean, I think I see that in cases that, people that come to me, and I think they're looking, the dilemma and the challenge is they're looking for something spiritual and meaningful. Yet, many of them or their families have had bad experiences with organized religion. And so it's like, how do you talk to them about, because it's important to the relationship, to the rapport. I mean, think about it. They're coming to the doctor for help, which means that implicitly they have some hope. Now, I do see people that are absolutely don't have any hope. So part of having hope is they've got to have some spiritual instinct, something more, yet they have a bad feeling, a bad taste about organized religion. Now what do we do? And I'm interested to learn. I mean, I have not had a chance to really study what the Army's doing in that area.
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of the things that we do, and especially from our training side, which is our BOLIC area, and especially we focus on this during our clinical pastoral education curriculum, is to really look at the sense of hope, like you said, right? What is the source of hope that is beyond us? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a particular religious orientation to have that sense of hope, right? It is whatever it is that gives us hope for the future. And the other part of that is, what is a common ground as human beings, right? What is, beyond all of the different religious differences, what are the basic elemental common themes we have as human beings? The desire to love and to be loved, to be in community, right? To belong, which is that, I think, one of the reasons why a lot of people join the military, even with all of the benefits and everything, but it is that sense of belonging to some greater purpose or organization that is beyond us. And I think so within that military context, that speaks well enough. And again, outside of the sort of the, anomalies, but for the general populace that join the military, with the larger population, we are talking about those who want to believe in something that's beyond us. We want to belong to an organization that has a higher purpose and meaning. And so I think these are places where we find common ground, and we can help then tap into what is it particularly for that individual. Who are the important people in their lives? What are the people or the things that give them hope and purpose and meaning in life? And so then that's where we begin to converse with those who are struggling, right? And that, I think, is what we're really focusing on in terms of the chaplaincy is concerned.
Mark, I want to pose a question for you that's related to earlier conversations and in other webinars where we've talked about the early training, rather brief for many Army chaplains, and it's a bit later that some go on to the CPE training that would be more intensive related to some of these matters. So in the kind of basic training for a person entering chaplaincy, what does that coursework entail that would prepare any chaplain to be able to identify concerning behaviors?
So they get in our 3-month, roughly 15 and a half week, about 12 and a half weeks of basic chaplain basic officer leadership course,
Right.
or otherwise known as CHOBO. Like, what they get there is an introduction to world religions and the issues of pluralism, all the issues of diversity and how to minister within the context of pluralism, including gender, sexual orientation, religious diversity, all of those things. So really, they get a broad exposure to all of that. And then they get exposure to basic counseling skills. So what kind of questions do you ask? How do you stay with the patient? I mean, with the soldier or those whom the chaplain is counseling. So those are the basic fundamental things that they get, in addition to a lot of the military training that they get in terms of how to be a chaplain within the battalion and at different echelon levels. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I think it points to one vulnerability, because that's pretty. I mean, depending on the situation, that's brief for spotting. I mean, I'm not saying it's inadequate, but there's a lot going on in a unit at any given time. The other question I wanted to ask you is from the reading that we attached for this webinar. In that reading, which was in the Military Times, it described the pressure on enlistment officers to recruit, and there were clear signs in the life of the young man who they finally did recruit, and then he killed himself. So, can you say more about the kinds of pressures that might lead a recruiter to, to put aside some concerns to meet some of perhaps the quota that person was also held to? That's my question.
Okay. So it came in very broken. No,
okay.
You came in very broken. I'm having a lot of
let me try
bandwidth issues. But I think I got the gist of your question was, what are the pressures that the recruiters are facing in terms of recruiting?
That's right. That was at the center of the article that we used for this webinar.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of how, I can't speak on behalf of all the recruiters out there and what pressures that they're feeling. Obviously, we have to hit numbers, and they're getting pressure to meet the quotas. And I think this year was the first time we came actually close to, if not meeting the actual numbers. But yeah, I do know anecdotally that they are under a lot of pressure to meet the numbers. And I don't know what their operations are in terms of, how pressured are they so that they have to overlook. That might be just the one-off. I mean, I really have a suspicion that is not something that is more a norm. Rather, it was just a one-off. Because I do know the recruiters that I know out there, they're really doing their best to meet mission within regulations and within standards.
Okay, it was certainly featured in the article from Military Times, so that's part of why I raised it. I can imagine that that might be a factor, but not a controlling factor, as you're also suggesting. It could be there, but you're hopeful that they wouldn't yield to that. I think that's part of what you're saying. Yeah,
Nancy, let me just
Stephen?
add. Yeah,
Sure.
I think that what your point, they could. I mean, I know that Mark's having, I can see you're having difficulty getting the electrons to you. Look, yeah, they're meeting the standards. They know what they can do. They know what the criteria is. But what we're talking about are the things that don't necessarily come out when you talk about criteria. What we're talking about is, and things that, frankly, an 18-year-old talking to a recruiter may not even fully appreciate. Right? I mean, these, it's remarkable, right? I've seen any number of young people come from very harsh circumstances where they've had, that it's been tough for all sorts of reasons, including that there's been abuse and neglect. But the tendency of young people is, I can push through it. I can get over it. It doesn't bother me. And then there's a trigger. Then there's something down the road. And they realize, oh, this really did bother me. This really did get embedded. And so what we end up trying to figure out is how down they're into their training, they've done a year or 2 years, they're in the Army. What is it now that as they've gotten a little older, they realize that, maybe where they came from was a lot tougher than what they felt and knew about. And now it's bothering them, and now they got to figure out what to do next. I think it's that kind of thing. I mean, there are recruiters that basically say, hey, don't say that. There was another incident where a recruiter, I have a case that I just got, a young man committed suicide, where he had actually in high school been diagnosed as schizophrenic. And the recruiter told him to go off his medication. And while he was off his medicine, he could pass his physical and get into the Army, which he did. And then, of course, because it takes 6 to 8 weeks for the medicine to wash out of your system, after it completely washed out, he had another schizophrenic break. And then from there, he went on and he committed suicide. So that happens, but I think those are probably one-off. I think the bigger issue is, how do we really grasp the lives of these young people? One factor I don't know, and maybe Chaplain Lee can talk to us a little bit more about it, is the social media, right, has a huge impact on young people, right? We've seen all sorts of reports on social media affecting suicides, a lot of them in young women, adolescent young women, but in men. And that's a big factor here. And I don't know if we understand how that particularly also influences and stresses out our young soldiers and families. I mean, do you have some idea from that, Mark?
No, I have not seen any type of studies that the Army has done on social media and its impact. But anecdotally, I can see, how sometimes that isolated worldview and they get captured into the social media world, that can will have an impact on mental health. And I want to sort of revisit that whole issue of like recruiters. Obviously, human beings are human beings, so there are going to be one-offs where they're not following what they're supposed to do. And I think one of the other important factors is in that recruiting, they're not asking for how their family life was, how many traumatic events that this young person grew up with. So a lot of those factors are not revealed, right? So there are a lot of the unknowns, and we're getting. I'm really, for me personally, I'm convinced that a lot of issues that a lot of young people go through in their families and as they're growing up really have a huge impact on the ways in which they encounter life in the military. And sometimes it's just not helpful. And so, how can we screen those out? It's an impossibility.
I think you're absolutely right. I think then as you bring it up, the other thing we also have to recognize is the generation gap. And that we might learn and see about social media, but if you bring in an 18-year-old and then the first sergeant is 38, I mean, that's a pretty big gap. And they've grown up in different worlds. And the first sergeant's been through combat, and the young person has not been through combat. And they're looking at things very differently. They've got different priorities. They have a different sense of responsibility, and a different sense of, for that matter, respect for your elders, and
Yeah. It's not just even the difference between the 38-year-old first sergeant and the 18-year-old private. We saw this recently in the younger chaplains that are coming through our schools. One of our instructors told me, do you realize that a lot of these battalion chaplains, they have gone through one assignment. So their first assignment was 3 years at a battalion where the first couple of years of their formation as a battalion chaplain, brand new in the Army, they had not interacted with soldiers on the way in which we grew up because they were coming into the Army during COVID. So the first year and a half to 2 years of their career in the Army was all on Zoom or Teams. And so they don't know how to interact with soldiers in the ways in which we were taught and did. And so that was a huge impact for me, thinking, wow, their socialization as Army chaplains in the battalion are completely and radically different than what I came through.
I want to get into a couple more questions before we turn to the kind of free for all of questions to you. But one of the questions that came up was from Rita, and it has to do with the ways in which certainly a number of folks in the armed forces and the Army in particular experienced both Iraq and Afghanistan as problematic wars, not what they had signed up for. And so finding oneself thinking you're going to defend democracy or whatever, and then finding that your side is behaving in ways that is challenging. We did a webinar on this last spring, and I wonder, so if we shifted from suicides from basic training or just entry to more broadly, if there are other factors such as what I've mentioned of kind of demoralization related to the service itself and rationale and what are we doing here. So I wanted to raise that factor and get a little bit away from the entry level.
Well, that's what I was trying to, when I tell you about the cases of the older cohort that had 2 or 3 tours, that, particularly I heard from more than one NCO over the years that they lost confidence in what we were doing in our mission. They lost confidence in any sense that there was, quote unquote, going to be victory. And everything, what was important to them was their relationship with their fellow soldiers, with their squad. And in fact, when that relationship got disrupted, sometimes when returning back to CONUS, redeploying, they felt more depressed and really more isolated, because what was most important was the connections. I do think there's a huge issue here that I mean, I find it, more than a bit. The fact is that my career has been bookended, my military career, even though I retired before Iraq, Afghanistan, but I've been active. My military career has been bookended by 2 wars that quote unquote America lost: Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
That is very, very disheartening.
Mm-hmm.
And makes you wonder, okay, so what are we going to do? What is our military? What's our purpose here? What are we out here to do? How do we get people to think about why it's important? Why do we? I clearly believe we need a strong military. I clearly believe we need to make every effort to defend this country against all enemies. But how are we doing it? Where do we pick the wars? Where do we fight them? How do we prepare people? How do we give them confidence? How do we make sure that they have trust in what we're doing? Those are challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're very realistic challenges.
Mark, do you have any response to that before we begin to move to the larger audience?
Yes. I think my response is a bit mixed. So I think rather than the mission or the lack of purpose or the disillusionment of the mission, I think what Dr. Xenakis hit in is the very sense of isolation after mission, right? The reason I think a lot of people sort of go into this spiral and eventually either commit suicide or attempt suicide are those who live in isolation with their own nightmares, with their own demons, and not necessarily because of what did or did not happen. That is part of that equation. But those who do well are those who have the community around them, that support system, fellow veterans and others to listen to them, walk with them, to help them process what they're going through. Those are the ones that actually do end up surviving. So I think it's very important for me. It's not to focus on Iraq and Afghanistan and who to blame, what to blame, and all of that. It's really what we do afterwards and what we continue to do for them and with them. Is to provide really the community and the support that they need ongoing.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to raise a question that's come in from the chat related to situations in which there are one discovers that maybe an officer leading a group, depending on the service, there might be a different title for that person, but where there's a problem with that person's behavior that complicates the experience of those under his command. And what are that certainly happens. And what are the safeguards or options for a soldier or a fellow officer, perhaps, that notices this, to safely raise a flag that they have witnessed problematic behavior by an officer over, leading a group, and how do they raise that in a way that might safely, for that person that raises it, but also for those under the command of the supposed problematic behavior. How does that happen?
Mark, you want to take it? I can tell you what my experience was. Yeah, you take it first, I'll mention what I think.
Right. I think several different ways, right? So
okay.
Yeah, so several different ways. I think one sort of the various avenues of approach.
Right.
So within leadership, within direct leadership, any individual can go over the commander to his or higher next level commander. right? Now, there are going to be consequences in terms of like, it better be dire, right?
Yeah.
They're going to ask, did you work it through the chain of command? And of course, if you have worked it through the chain of command, you've come to the highest level, and that individual is the problem, then every soldier has the legal right and the responsibility to take it to the next level commander. Right? That's one avenue of approach. I think another avenue of approach as a chaplain is I've had soldiers who come to me and say, hey, we got some issues here. And I start talking to people, finding out what's really happening. And then I raise it to levels of command. And if that doesn't get solved, then I take it to his or her higher level of command. And of course, through then my technical chain, which is like, if I'm at the battalion, I'm going to work it through my brigade chaplain and so on and so forth, so that we're going parallel process there. And I think there's then the legal aspect of that, right? You can certainly, every soldier has a right to go to the IG, the Inspector General, file a complaint. And that's an anonymous complaint, which then launches an investigation. Then that commander, he or she, will be investigated and disciplinary actions properly taken. And you see this in the Military Times, various news all the time, where toxic leaders, as we call them, have been taken out and replaced immediately once they're, in fact, they're taken out during the investigation. And once the investigation is ended, they're removed from command. So I think that's really an effective way in which we do things in the Army. And there is one other avenue, which is the EO, equal opportunity. So if any issues of gender orientation, ethnicity, kind of discriminatory acts, or even comments or anything like that, any soldier can raise that with EO, and there would be proper investigation conducted.
I think that's excellent what Mark said. Let me just add that this is the art for chaplains and medics. This is the art of what we do. Because as advisors to commanders and as advocates, we really are advocates for our soldiers and for their health and welfare and their families. But there's no clear set of tactics here that we can use, but we have to accept the responsibility. And one rule here is as medics or chaplains, we have accepted the responsibility to speak truth to power. We have accepted the responsibility to say things that other people will not say. Now, there is an art to doing that. And each of us really learns over time. And we learn because I've probably done it badly as well as I've done it well in my course of my lifetime. We learn what's the best way to do that. And also because of the situation, right? I mean, there are times when you hear about things happening in a command and you hear about the conduct of a leader, a first sergeant or commander, and you can say, I don't think this is right. And they might say, okay. They might listen to you. There's other times they'll say, hey, Doc, you're crazy. You're a psychiatrist. You don't know what you're talking about. This is exactly the way we're going to do it. And you go, I think we have a problem. We're going to have to figure something out. We don't want it taken out on the soldier. Now, there's times that soldiers actually are problem people themselves, and they don't want to be counseled. They don't want to be advised, and they don't want to learn and practice the discipline that they're supposed to, that they know that they've got to do. And they'd rather raise complaints than not. So that we got to know. And then in another area, and this is not what we're talking about, but I do think it led to suicide, is we've got soldiers who've been victims of sexual trauma. And it was done very covertly, secretly. It was done in a way that was very coercive. They may or may not tell you. I mean, I felt that a number of male soldiers committed suicide, had been the victims of sexual trauma, and they weren't going to tell anybody. They felt ashamed. And that's just our job to very thoughtfully, tactfully, with tactic, probe and bring that out, and then know what's the mentality of our commanders, what's the mentality of this particular unit, and what we can do. But that's what we're here to do.
Mhm.
That's what makes us so important.
Yeah. And we have to hope that with regard to that, both, of course, women and men have experienced that, and the change to, be able to go to command with that report we may find that it does help reduce the despair that might lead to suicide for a person that's repeatedly assaulted, for example, which we know has happened.
Sure.
So you're certainly right, and both men and women have experienced that. That's for certain. Um, let me see if you have more questions for each other at this point in
I'm
the
going to have
webinar.
to,
I think
I'm
Mark.
sorry, I have to pop out as I talked about earlier. It's that time for me.
Okay.
Sorry.
Good seeing you.
Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for being with us. Good seeing you.
Yeah.
Likewise. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So, Stephen, you get to hold the show.
Yeah.
But let me also see if there are other points that we haven't raised or we haven't adequately addressed that you want to surface and perhaps get some response from those who are watching. But what's your sense of the concern about the fear of reporting or reluctance to report?
Oh, I think it's real. I mean,
Mhm.
that's very real. And I think it's confusing. I mean, look, I think if I haven't seen a case recently of a male who's sexually assaulted. I have seen cases of women who have been, and they're very worried about it, and
Yeah.
what to do and how they say and how they go about it, and are they going to be, is it what the backlash is going to be? Are they going to get scapegoated? Look, I think it's
Sure.
a problem.
Well, now you go to special prosecutors, which we have yet to see, instead of going to command,
Yeah.
as an effort to better manage the privacy of that report and assure it. But time will tell if that is adequate. Um, I there are some questions about strategies for persons that have experienced um, challenging situations, let's say, or violent situations, in terms of letter writing or narrative therapeutic strategies. And they've asked whether that's what your sense of um, that sort of therapy promoted in sacred texts of war.
I mean, I think again, it's individualized. What I
Mhm.
try and do is when people come for help is, again, if I can establish rapport, and I have to recognize that, I can't establish rapport with everybody. And I will say to you that as a young officer and one of a handful of psychiatrists as an installation, I almost had to assume that I could establish rapport with everybody because there was nobody else to send them to for therapy. So I
Yeah.
felt boxed in. Sometimes
Mhm.
I could figure it out and work with somebody else and work it out. Now, in my as more senior that I am and not in uniform, I'm very aware that they're just folks that aren't going to connect. It's about me, it's my personality or what they're like or what's happened. It's just not going to happen. But having said that, if I'm able to establish rapport and we can sort of get everything out, then the next step is let's figure out what's probably going to be most helpful to you. And if you need a private way of being able to tell your story, and maybe you know normally, some people think visually. Some people think, in pictures and sounds. Some people, not everyone thinks in words. They need other ways of being able to bring out what their, deepest thoughts are, or fears, or worries. And if this kind of way, if this modality is going to help you, then let's play with it. Let's see. It's empirical. So I do have patients where I say, look, I think this is a good thing. I think you should be journaling. Mm-hmm. I think we can talk about what you're journaling. I think maybe you should be doing a little bit of art. We should talk about what you're drawing. Let's hear all those for you. The key is good observation, being conscientious, and thinking about what's going to fit for that patient. Mm-hmm. Not about the technique. I'm sort of allergic to cookbooks.
Okay. So I think even though it's a little early, I think it's time to open this up and let's hear what other members, folks in the audience might want to ask you now, and or conversation we want to have together. So Sam, if you could do that, that'd be great. Rita has a question for us. Go for it, Rita.
Okay. One of the ways that we've worked with veterans, and I don't know if this would work in the military at all, but we've worked with them using trained peer facilitators who work with small groups of veterans. And we use multiple strategies like art, like writing, like things like the different modalities, including journaling and sharing of their struggles that they're in. And in working through that process and trying to figure out why I thought it worked as well as it did, I set upon this understanding of ritual processes as ways that actually change people without their having to change themselves. And the effectiveness of that. I've realized that the program we pilot tested it before COVID for 2 years, got great survey data, thought we had a pretty good evidence-based program that we were going to raise a lot of money for and implement. And then COVID hit and we had to stop. It just stopped it cold because it was 50 hours in person. But as I thought about during the years we couldn't implement it and we started trying to do things online, I started thinking about what was it about that 50 hours that seemed almost magical. And things happened that I couldn't possibly have anticipated that were more positive than anything I had dreamed would happen. So I started deeply digging into ritual theory. And there is something even in the therapeutic environment that has a ritual quality to it. It's a liminal space. It's set aside from ordinary life, and you go in there and it's not going to be forever. So you have this moment and it has beginning, middle, and end. And I think that there's something about that structure, that way of setting people in a space where they know that something might happen and they get a chance to work on it. But in a group process, they actually are changed by the group process itself and not by their own individual effort. And I wondered if you had looked at that at all as a way of supporting people who might be experiencing suicidality.
Well, look, I don't know what they're doing now, but I will tell you that 50 years ago, a little less, we were doing a lot of that. We were doing all sorts of things in terms of group and bringing people together. Maybe we didn't identify them as peer counselors, But a lot we wanted to do was go to squad leaders and platoon leaders and first sergeants and other key people and say, hey, look, I think this is something you could do for your fellow soldiers. And I think you all need to be doing this together. And we would be advising the leadership of the units about how to do that kind of thing. I mean, I think those principles are sound and solid, and they've been, over the years, we've seen what their value is. It's a matter of just thinking about how you can do it now in this particular environment, which probably opens things up. I mean, it depends on what the op tempo is. The difference between working with veterans and working with the active duty is we always have to be thinking about what's the op tempo. You know, what training do they have to do? Are they going to deploy? What skills? How are they going to be in the field? I mean, we got to keep this in mind as we set up these kinds of programs. I think the more part of the quote depathologizing them is you find the way that you weave them into the regular activities, into the op tempo. And by the way, one of the ways is during physical training, because everybody's together, they can do things together. By and large, most soldiers are like learn from motor tasks, right? It's their conduct, it's what they're doing that is most refreshing to them. So there's just taking these principles and saying, let's find out what's the smartest way that we can use them to accomplish what we think is important.
We had Jonathan Shea help us create the program, and he was adamant that the squad model, that small group model, was the most effective way to work with veterans because it was a trust model they recognized.
I think he's right.
Yeah.
I know teaching students that were veterans, but now separated from that intense experience, that there was something substantial for some students about missing that camaraderie, missing what had been their most intense and positive experience of community. So that was raised earlier, and I wanted to lift that up. Stephen, one of the things that you've written about persuasively and addressed in a webinar toward the end of last year is the after effects of traumatic brain injury. And given that we've certainly have veterans who have been in armored combat and likely experienced that, I wonder if you might briefly talk about how that could address suicidality.
Well, I mean, so you're looking at people who've been 3 or 4 tours, had exposure to multiple IEDs, and or 15% of airborne jumps, the soldier hits the head, and over time that causes accumulates. We've seen the cases of the people who've gone to the range, the artillery, and just exposure to those blasts. So over this piles up. And then the soldier gets late 30s, early 40s, the other changes occurring, and then they start thinking, I'm not thinking as sharp. I'm having problems getting things done. They sort of wonder, okay, where am I going next? And so as they're starting to recognize that they may have some diminishing thinking, and they may have other problems, like I said, with sleep, because if the blast, not only does it affect those neurons that have to do with your thinking, by the way, with coordination, because we know that there's problems in the system that have to do with motor coordination. All these things pile up, and I think that really just gets to be, people lose. I think sometimes you'll have soldiers that are losing hope, and that's where you have to start to talk to them about, how is this affecting you? How badly do you feel about this? How do you think this is playing out? What problems you're having? have you been thinking at some time or another of hurting yourself or taking your life?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And by that time, the person may not, is out of the service, and who's going to notice?
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, and this is where it becomes important that, we do get the VA, we send them, we really need to be, I feel it may be tough conversation when the soldier's transitioning out, but I do think we're obligated to have these tough conversations with them if they've had 3 or 4 tours in Iraq. And that the medics and the chaplains need to understand as much as they can about this problem and how it affects the soldier's life.
Right. Presently, traumatic brain injury is not included, or at least several months ago, it wasn't included in the training for VA chaplains. So it's still an underrepresented factor, I'd say. That appears anyway. And treated as a medical one. So that rather rigid line, I guess you could say, is something that needs to be addressed clearly. Yeah.
Look, I think it's completely impractical. I mean, for chaplains are going around and they're talking to veterans about, how their things are going, what their lives are like, how they're getting through the day. And they should be, if you're going to ask them about, I assume, I mean, this is what works best, is just kind of have a natural conversation with your soldier or veteran. And as they're getting through the day, if you say, well, you're seeing memory problems, then you open up the conversation. Is this a problem? Because, in their lives, if they're having memory problems, they may be having other problems with their intimate partner, or people, their family that they're living with. I mean, let's get this out. We're not helping things by keeping it hidden.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we've come to the, I'm going to see if there are other final thoughts that you'd like to share before we close this webinar.
Well, one, I want to thank you and salute you for doing this. I mean, I think this is really important. I think you brought us to get the people together, and I think that by doing that, you're giving confidence to the chaplains, and you're certainly helping the people that they're supposed to be helped. So I want to thank both you and Rita for everything that you're doing to do this, to set it up. I guess my thought here, and what I want to bring it back to, is either as a chaplain or a medic, is to bring back the perception, experience of the whole person. That this man or woman or child is not just some composite diagnoses. And if I'm going to be most effective, I need to really respect, acknowledge, engage with the whole person. And then in that sense is what I want. I'm Greek Orthodox. And in that sense, what I want from my priest. I don't want to go to my priest and for him to think of me as a doctor or a general or a husband or father or a grandfather. I want him to know that this is who I am. My identity, my sense of self is much more than all those attributes. We live in a world that we like to do that. We compartmentalize and we silo and we break things into attributes that we can work with. But I think that what we can do is we can clearly carry forth the attitude, the spirit, the commitment that we're going to deal with the whole person. So with that, I really thank you all for everything that you're doing here. I think that that's really important, and it's been a pleasure to spend the afternoon with you.
Thank you for being with us. And for those of you on the webinar, know that in approximately 10 days, you can find a recording of this webinar, both at the VOA page and at Brite's Soul Repair Center page. And it will remain there, and it's then in the file actually of all previous webinars. So we want to thank you for being with us, and certainly, Stephen, we thank you for sharing your expertise with us on a very important topic. And Sam, thank you for your help in the technology that all of this required. We'll look forward to seeing you all next month for our next webinar. And thank you very much for today, Stephen.
Sure. Everyone stay safe and healthy. Really.
Thank you, Doctor. Thanks, Nancy.
Bless you all. Thanks. Bye-bye.